The bedroom door had just closed behind the midwife when he turned to me. I was still in the bed, still bleeding. The baby was 7 hours old, sleeping in the wooden cradle his father had built before the harvest. My body felt like it had been turned inside out and put back wrong. My hands were shaking, not from cold, from everything. He sat down on the edge of the bed, not to hold my hand, not to ask if I needed water. He said, "We need to talk about when things go back to normal." I was 22 years old. I had just given birth to my first child in a farmhouse in Holmes County, Ohio. And my husband was sitting beside me, 7 hours after our son entered the world, telling me he had already calculated how long he was willing to wait. Before I go any further, my name is Martha. I grew up old order Amish and I left, and this channel is where I finally say the things my community never once permitted me to say out loud. If you want to hear the truth about what plain life looks like from the insides of it, subscribe now and tap the like button. And tell me in the comments, did anyone in your life ever explain to you what a wife was and was not allowed to refuse? Because nobody ever explained it to me. Not once. Let me tell you what I understood about marriage before I became a wife. I understood that a wife submits. I understood that a wife serves. I understood that a wife's body is not entirely her own once vows are spoken, because the Ordnung, that unwritten, unspoken, absolute code that governs every breath you take inside an Amish community, the Ordnung does not draw clean lines around what belonging to a husband means. It leaves those lines blurry, and in my community, in the one I was raised inside of, blurry lines always bent in the same direction. I was taught that the purpose of marriage was godly household building, children, work, faithfulness. I was taught that a wife who keeps her husband satisfied is a wife doing her duty. I was taught this not through a direct conversation, because we did not have those, but through the silence around certain questions. Through the way older women's faces went careful when a young married woman looked too tired for too long. Through the way nobody ever said the word no, and nobody ever said the word aloud, and nobody ever said the word yours. What I was not taught, what I was permitted to ask for, what I was permitted to refuse, what the weeks after childbirth were supposed to mean for a woman's body, and what protection, if any, the community considered it appropriate to extend to her. I found out what that silence meant 7 hours after my son was born. There is a tradition in plain communities that most outsiders have never heard of. The medical world calls it postpartum recovery. Most modern women know that the body needs 6 weeks of healing after childbirth. 6 weeks during which intimacy is medically inadvisable, during which internal tissue is still repairing, during which a woman is, in the most literal biological sense, still open and vulnerable to damage. In my community, this period was acknowledged, not warmly, not protectively. It was acknowledged the way the Ordnung acknowledges most inconvenient truths, by surrounding it with so many conditions that the protection it appeared to offer meant almost nothing in practice. Here is what I was told, indirectly, through the whisper network of Amish women that I described in other videos. You are given 6 weeks. 6 weeks is the number that comes from scripture and tradition and the bishop's understanding of what a woman's body requires. 6 weeks during which a husband is expected to exercise patience. 6 weeks was the protection. He asked me to set the clock back to 5. My husband's name was Caleb. He was 26 years old. He was not a cruel man in the way that word is usually understood. He did not raise his voice. He did not use his hands in anger. In many ways he was gentle. He helped with the animals. He was present at the birth, which some men in our community were not. He had built the cradle himself, carefully, over 3 months, and sometimes I caught him standing over it before our son arrived, running his fingers along the wood. But Caleb had also grown up inside the same silence I had grown up inside. He had been taught the same things about wifehood that I had been taught about husbandhood. He had learned that patience was a virtue, and that 6 weeks was the expectation, and he had decided, sitting beside me while I was still bleeding, that 5 weeks was close enough. He did not ask. He told me what he had decided, quietly, in the tone that in our community meant this is not a negotiation, and then he went downstairs to check on the animals, and I lay in that bed with my 7-hour-old son sleeping 3 feet away from me, and I thought, I don't know if I am allowed to say no. I want to be precise about this, because I know how it sounds from the outside, and I know how it felt from the inside, and those two things are not the same experience. From the outside, it sounds like something that has a word, a legal word, a word that in the world I live in now, outside the community, outside the Ordnung, I have heard therapists and doctors use without flinching. From the inside, it felt like confusion, not terror, not clarity. Confusion. Because I had never been given the word. I had never been given the framework. I had never sat in a room with someone who looked me in the face and said, "Your body belongs to you, and there are things you are permitted to refuse regardless of what vows you have taken." Nobody gave me that. What I had been given was duty. What I had been given was submission. What I had been given was the understanding that a good Amish wife does not create conflict in her marriage over her own physical preferences, that seeking her own comfort at the expense of her husband's is something close to hogmutt, pride, the worst thing you can be. So I lay in that bed and I calculated, the way women inside systems like this always calculate. Not whether, how. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here, not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. What I can tell you is this. My friend Rebecca had her first child 8 months before I had mine. She told me what happened to her in the same way Amish women tell each other everything, sideways, in the margins of another conversation, while we were putting up preserves in her kitchen the summer before my son was born. She said, "They don't really mean the 6 weeks." She said it so quietly I almost didn't hear it over the sound of the jars. I asked her what she meant. She set down the lid she was holding, and she looked at the window, not at me, and she said, "It's the number they say. It's not the number they keep." I thought about Rebecca lying in her own bed. I thought about her holding her own newborn against her chest. I thought about what she had already learned that I was still in the process of learning. And I felt something shift in my chest that I did not have a word for at the time. I have a word for it now. I learned it in therapy, sitting across from a woman who had never worn a prayer cap and never needed to. The word is grief, not for what happened, for how normal it was. Because here is the thing that took me the longest to understand, the thing that sat in my chest for years after I left, the thing my therapist eventually helped me name. It was not one man, it was not Caleb's particular failing, as a particular person. It was a system. It was a system that never once, in all the years I lived inside it, handed a young Amish woman the vocabulary to protect herself inside her own marriage. A system that named the 6-week period as protection and then filled the space around it with so much theology about submission and duty, and a wife's obligation that the protection dissolved before it was ever used. I know women who waited the full 6 weeks. I know women like Rebecca who did not. I know women who never knew there was a number at all, because nobody told them and they assumed from the first and night of their marriage that their body on a schedule was simply what marriage was. And I know something else. I know that the men inside this system, many of them, were not making calculated choices to cause harm. They were doing what they had been taught. They were operating inside the same silence we were. The silence did not only fail the wives, it failed the marriages. It failed everyone inside it. Caleb and I did not stay married, not because of that night specifically, because of the accumulation of all the nights. The accumulation of 100 conversations that never happened. The accumulation of a framework that told me my body was simultaneously sacred and not quite mine. By the time I left at 25, my son was 3 years old, and I was carrying a heaviness I could not name and a fury I was not permitted to feel. The shunning came quickly. It always does. My mother's face at the door, closed to me now the way doors close in plain communities. Completely, without drama, like water going stissel. Letters returned, phone calls that rang without answer. The community I had cooked for and sewn for and grieved alongside and celebrated alongside simply ceased to receive me. That is what leaving costs. I want to be honest about the price because I want to be honest about everything. And yet, in therapy, and I say this knowing how foreign the word therapy sounds in the same sentence as Ordnung and Prayer Cap and Holmes County. In therapy, I began to name things I had never been given names for: bodily autonomy, informed consent, the idea, radical to me at the time, that what happens to a woman's body after childbirth is a medical matter, and that medical matters have rights attached to them that no theology can fully dissolve. I remember the session where my therapist said to me, very quietly, that what I had described was a pattern she recognized, not specific to the Amish, not unique to plain communities, a pattern that appears wherever information is withheld, wherever women are not given language for their own experience, wherever submission is presented as a virtue without limits and refusal is presented as a sin. She said, "You were never told what you were allowed to say no to." I said, "I was never told I was allowed to say no." We sat with that for a long time. I want to say something carefully about Caleb before I finish because I think it matters. I have spent years working out what was his and what was the system's. I have not arrived at clean answers. He was not a monster. He was a man who had been raised, the same way I had been raised, with an incomplete and distorted understanding of what he was and was not permitted to ask for. He was a man who had never been handed a framework that made space for a woman's refusal, and so when the moment came, he simply moved without one. That does not excuse what happened, but it complicates it, and I think the complication matters because the complication is where the real story lives, not in the clean villain, in the ordinary man, in the ordinary woman, in the community that stood behind both of them and offered only silence. The Ordnung does not write these things down. That is the point. What is unwritten cannot be challenged. What is unwritten can be shaped by whoever holds the most authority in the room. In my marriage, in my community, in the farmhouse in Holmes County where my son was 7 hours old and the bedroom door had just closed behind the midwife. In that room, I was not the one who held the authority. I know that now. I needed years and distance and a therapist in a bright office with windows and a word like autonomy before I understood that what happened to me was not simply the nature of marriage. That there was nothing sacred about that particular silence. That the body that had just labored through the night to bring a new life into the world was deserving of rest and time and care and above all the right to say, not yet, not because of a rule, not because of a number, because it was mine. If you grew up somewhere that never handed you that sentence, if you were taught from childhood that your body's needs were always secondary to someone else's theology, I see you. If you have sat in a bed in the dark, calculating the mathematics of obligation, trying to work out what you were permitted to refuse, I see you. You were not wrong for not knowing. Nobody gave you the map. I am trying, one story at a time, to give it to you now. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video, and that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely, they might just save your life.